at the end of the day, there is a war in Europe ongoing, and there is less focus on it than the conflict with the Islamic State in the Middle East. Hi guys, I'm Henry Langston, a correspondent here at Vice News. I just came back from covering the ceasefire in Ukraine, and before that I was covering the reaction of Russia's neighbours towards the Ukraine crisis, specifically in Lithuania. So I'm looking forward to your questions today.
Hey Henry, thanks for coming on the show, man.
It's all right.
Glad to have you here.
Always a pleasure.
You say that now. We have a bunch of people who want to talk to you, starting with Dean, who's calling us on Skype. So let's say hi to Dean.
Great. Hi, Dean.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you, man?
Good. It's good to be here.
Great. What's your first question?
So I wanted to ask, since you're just back from the ceasefire line in Ukraine, about some reports over the last few days that some of Ukraine's volunteer battalions have sort of refused orders from the Ukrainian army to withdraw and have even interfered with some of the tactical maneuvers as they back away from the ceasefire line. And I wanted to ask, since you were embedded on both sides of the line, what's the relationship between these volunteer battalions and the actual formal Ukrainian army? How do the kind of people on the ground view each other, and what do they think of their future going forward together?
Well, the volunteer battalions, most of them now have been absorbed either into the military through the National Guard, or groups like Kiev 1 and the Dnipro Battalion. They've been absorbed into the police. So they now operate directly under government control, although there are some groups such as the Dudayev Battalion, which is a completely independent militia founded by a Chechen fighter. They are completely independent, as are the Right Sector, who were a group very prominent during the Euromaidan revolution, so an ultra-nationalist group. And they now also fight on the front lines and help with logistics, but they operate outside of the direct control of the military. So they don't necessarily get supplies from the army. They have to source a lot of their own supplies, though I think there's definitely some trickle down of ammunition and weapons, but they're sort of seen, I mean, they're very useful. The battalions in general are very useful, but some have been disbanded because of their activities, like Idar Battalion and Tornado. Tornado recently sort of held themselves up in a school building because they were told to disband, and they refused to, and they said they were going to fire on anyone that tried to take away their weapons from them. That situation was resolved, but they were still disbanded. Idar Battalion, mainly from the Luhansk region, they were disbanded. And a lot of these groups, well, at least those two, and the Right Sector actually have been implicated in a number of extrajudicial killings, torture, and extortion rackets. So, I mean, on one hand, the government knows they need some of these larger battalions like Dnipro, Donbass, Kiev, but some of the more independent ones are definitely useful, but also causing a lot of trouble. And so that's a situation I think the government really needs to start getting a hold on.
So, did you have a chance to ask any ordinary Ukrainians or Ukrainian soldiers what they personally feel about these more independent groups? I think the reports I was reading were specifically about the Azov battalion, but I'm just wondering what kind of more ordinary people think of this.
I mean, there's a lot of support for some of these groups. They get a lot of their funding, a lot of their supplies, food, body armor, sometimes even weapons from public donations. So there are a lot of support for these groups, but obviously that's on the Ukrainian side. Groups like the Right Sector are vilified by civilians and obviously DNR soldiers inside DNR territory. I mean, like the government, there's a love-hate relationship between some of these groups, especially civilians who have obviously been caught up in areas under the control of some of these groups where there is no formal oversight over some of them, and therefore some of these civilians have obviously been exploited, kidnapped, and in some cases killed. So it's a very tricky situation for the government to get a hold of, but it's something they just need to. I mean, I think groups like the Right Sector, they really need to decide what they are going to do with them. But obviously, we saw only last week there was a big rally in Kiev of the supporters of Right Sector and other sort of nationalist groups calling for sort of more action on the Ukrainian side against the DNR. You know, the ceasefire is essentially pointless and they want to push forward. So there is on the ground support for these groups, but the government needs to figure out how it can control them.
Yeah, they didn't do so well in the last elections, but they do, I think, get a lot of donations.
Yeah, there was fear that Right Sector would do really well in the elections, but they got, I think, 1.6% of the vote. So that didn't really materialize. But there is a general support from obviously pro-Ukrainians of these groups and these people that go and risk their lives to fight in the Donbass.
And what about on the DNR side of the line? Did you see, I mean, there have been a lot of reports that Russians are providing training, trying to make this a more professional force in Donetsk. What did people have to say about that?
Well, the DNR soldiers that we spoke to this time around, we spent time with the Vostok and the Oplot battalions, and they were very dismissive of Russian involvement, claiming that basically they weren't there. I mean, we personally didn't see any Russian soldiers, though I think with the situation how it is, I mean, there is a lot of fighting, but the front lines are essentially static. So those frontline positions on the DNR side, from what we saw, seem to be manned by more regular DNR forces. And if you look at what happened in Debaltseve in February, we know that Russian soldiers are used to attack and take territory rather than to necessarily hold it and also man checkpoints, that sort of thing. But last month, the Dnipro battalion, Ukrainian battalion, flew some drones over a military camp just north of Mariupol and found what they are saying is a Russian military base. They found 9 modern T-72 tanks, communications equipment, dugouts, lots of tents. I mean, they fear that this is a Russian base where they are also training troops, but also possibly preparing for an assault on Mariupol, which is the economic powerhouse of the Donetsk region now. And it's a city that the DNR have claimed many times that they want to take it, you know, despite there being, or there meant to be, a ceasefire in place.
And this base is in Ukraine's borders, correct?
Yes, it's about, it's 15 kilometers, I think, from Ukrainian positions east of Volnovakha. So it's sort of south of Donetsk, north of Mariupol. And if you were to take Mariupol, the DNR would want to cut that highway between Donetsk and Mariupol, and that sort of position of that base with that armor and the soldiers there, that would be basically, I think that's what people are saying that would be used for.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much, Dean.
Dean, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
Cool. So, Henry, we actually have a ton of people on Twitter who are sending us questions, but I want to read one as you know we're getting some stuff live, but I want to start with one that we got a little bit in advance.
Okay, sure.
And Claymore wants to know, how would you describe the dangers of doing your job, journalism, during the conflict in Ukraine?
I mean, there's a myriad of dangers covering any conflict. Ukraine, especially, there is a lot of the use of shelling by both sides, or definitely throughout the war since it started properly last summer. A number of journalists have been killed doing their job in eastern Ukraine, so that the threat is very real. And obviously we are there documenting the threat to civilians there, so it's very apparent the risks involved. The shelling is a real problem because you can be covering an area that is a frontline position, and there's every chance that those positions or that town could come under fire. Debaltseve, covering that in January, February was very difficult because the town was constantly under artillery fire. So, we were also speaking to people who had to live in their basements because that was the daily reality for them at the time. Obviously, we take there's a lot of mitigation when we are there to ensure that we are not taking unnecessary risks. But it's a very dangerous conflict to cover, and it will continue to be. The lot of shelling has meant that there is a lot of unexploded ordnance that is going to be there for a long time and is going to be a continuing problem for the civilians there, but also journalists have been wounded and killed by sort of landmines and unexploded artillery shells. So there are a lot of risks involved in covering Ukraine, but we're always trying to make sure that we're keeping ourselves safe and those that we are with safe.
Well, great, man. So I'm glad that you're safe. Duh.
Me too.
But so let's talk to some more people on Skype.
Sure.
Let's say to Christina. Christina, you still there?
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, Christina.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great.
What is your question for today?
So my question relates more to your last video, which compares the situation in Lithuania with Ukraine. And obviously, I mean, I've seen reports about soldiers in Ukraine and the regular army making salaries the equivalent of $240, $350 a month, which obviously isn't very high. And the separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, they're making a comparable salary or even higher in some cases, according to reports. And so I'm wondering, how does this compare? How does the actual regular army in Ukraine compare with the army in Lithuania? I mean, Lithuania has a higher GDP per capita, but it's also a smaller country with fewer forces. Are the salaries and the resources in Lithuania comparable to those in Ukraine? I mean, how prepared would Lithuania be if Russia were to send little green men?
Well, I mean, we were there to cover this exercise, Operation Lightning Strike, which was to test the capabilities of their rapid reaction force, which is designed specifically to deal with the kind of hybrid war scenarios which we've seen in Ukraine. So combination of civilian protests, little green men, armed insurgents without any sort of obvious insignia, propaganda and cyber warfare. And the soldiers, this was all training to try and nip a sort of Ukraine-style situation in the bud quickly, so it doesn't sort of explode into what we see now in Ukraine, the loss of Crimea and most likely the permanent loss of Donetsk and parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And just before we actually went to Lithuania, there was they were basically upping the salary for the Lithuanian soldiers. In 2008 they scrapped conscription. I think it might have been a few years later, and now they're bringing it back. And now they realise that military is one thing that they're going to have to focus on over the next few years. So they're looking to up their spending for their military, as well as upping the salary for their soldiers to turn it into a more professional fighting force. And that includes buying more modern weapons and heavier weapons. So yeah, they're trying to make sure that they're as well equipped as they can possibly be for that kind of scenario. Though obviously, if it was a Russian invasion, the situation, they'd be very difficult for them to contain it on their own. So, thankfully for them, they are a member of NATO. Though this rapid reaction force was created because I think there was some degree on the government side there that the NATO wouldn't be able to react as quickly as they'd like to any sort of possible situation in their country, whether it be a hybrid war or whether it be a conventional invasion from Russian forces. But we've got a bit of Lithuania has been very hawkish on Russia. It's been very supportive of Ukraine. It's one of the only countries giving weapons to Ukraine. And it's also hosting a number of injured Ukrainian soldiers in its hospitals. It's very hawkish, but it has to be kept very careful. It has a very powerful neighbour, obviously, where the rhetoric has been very aggressive over the past year. And so they might be hawkish, but they're careful. So we've got a bit of a funny sort of clip from that film to show you now. So Major, could you tell me what we are looking at here?
We have the map of Lithuania. The red cubics reflect the adversary forces, those groups acting in this part of Lithuania. In the eastern part, they want to declare independence of the eastern Lithuania. We know that they get support by smuggling weapons, especially using those corridors in here from Parta. And we know the country of Parta is very close related and supported by country of Udia. We always, during the exercise, use artificial names, just in order not to get any kind of friction or political issues. Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely artificial countries and it has nothing to do with reality. That's the main idea we say during every kind of exercise.
So we're definitely saying that that's not Russia right there.
Absolutely.
So that was a kind of funny clip. We, we're in the HQ of the Operation Lightning Strike with one of the commanders showing us the map of the region, and then you've got, the Russian territory with a fake name of Udia, whereas the allied states to Lithuania, their names are perfectly normal, could use Latvia, could use Poland. So it just shows that, they might be hawkish, they might be, trying to prepare themselves, but they still don't want to essentially piss off their rather large neighbor.
And another thing that I'm wondering, really recently at the end of last month, the Pentagon announced that it's going to deploy hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles to 6 different countries in Eastern Europe, including Lithuania. Mm-hmm. And the Russians immediately responded and they said, okay, well, in that case, we're going to send more arms to our western flank as well. And then in an arms fair in Moscow, Putin actually started talking about nuclear-capable, intercontinental ballistic missiles. What do you think the consequences of such an overt military buildup would be? Is this just bravado that could have diplomatic consequences, or could there be real military consequences?
Ultimately, the amount of forces NATO and the US are moving into these countries is actually pretty small. At the end of the day, Russia is always going to have military superiority along its western borders. At the current rate of forces being moved into these Eastern European states is just nothing in comparison. So I think there's a bit of a risk. Obviously, both sides are trying to look very strong. It's all a part of a strong diplomacy on behalf of NATO and the US. But ultimately, it's very little. It might reassure some of those Baltic states slightly. But again, if Russia really wanted to stage an invasion of these countries, those forces wouldn't really be able to put up a long, sustained fight. So I think it's more a bit of show of force rather than something realistically practical at the end of the day.
And in terms of inciting social and national hatred and doing this in more of a covert way, you discussed in the video that the Russian minority in Lithuania is actually quite small, that this could reduce the possibilities. But aside from being small, I think one of the interesting things about Lithuania is that the various political parties, including very socially conservative political parties like the Order and Justice Party, they've really cultivated this image of Lithuania as this multi-ethnic, diverse, country that celebrates cultural and linguistic diversity. And most ethnic Lithuanians, they'll say that they feel comfortable relating with their Polish and their Russian neighbors. Did you find that in Lithuania, there's less of a likelihood that Russia would succeed in building sort of a nationalistic sentiment or animosity, less successful than in Ukraine, for example?
I think at the end of the day, this exercise was cultivated to deal with that kind of separatist threat of ethnic Russians or Russian speakers suddenly, rising up against Lithuania. But I think the likelihood is very slim ultimately. For a number of reasons. The population is small, but also Russia's motivations for doing so are pretty limited. No one really. Yes, we know there's a lot of aggressive rhetoric in the region following Ukraine. There's a lot of military buildup. But ultimately, if you would invade Lithuania or stoke war in Lithuania, that's a NATO and EU state. It's not Ukraine. Ukraine was sort of isolated in a way, it had no real powerful military allies that were going to come and save the day. Lithuania does. And so it's a much more aggressive ball game if that was something the Russians really wanted to do. So it's good to have these exercises. It's better to be prepared, whereas obviously the Ukrainians were not, and this is what we see now. But ultimately, I think that the chances are very slim.
Great. Do Lithuanians actually believe in NATO's guarantee of collective defense? Is this something that people feel confident about?
I think yes. They have to be as well. They have to believe in the NATO project. But I think, at the end of the day, NATO is under obligation. If Russia did invade or another country invaded, then NATO would have to come to Lithuania's aid. I think most people back it. They think majority of people support NATO membership, EU membership. These are very important. I mean, Lithuania is a fairly developed country. It's not like Ukraine that struggles with its economy. And I think they don't. Lithuanians at the end of the day don't want to be a part of some new Russian state or whatever. Like they're pretty happy in the current situation they're in, and so I think they're pretty confident that NATO would come to their aid. I think they'd certainly hope so, and I think NATO have shown their commitment by putting forces in their country and holding a lot of these joint exercises, not just Lithuania by itself, but there's a lot of joint NATO exercises between all the Baltic states, European states, and the United States. So these show that they're committed to these Baltic states.
Great,
all right.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. So, Henry, let's talk to Ashley, who's also on Skype. So
Sure.
Say hi to her.
Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Henry. So I'm just going to ask a few questions about, I guess, perceived truth, and then also just like how far removed people are from the news that we hear so readily, and then I guess pulling from what you and Christina were just talking about in regards to NATO.
Mm-hmm.
How far removed do you find people there on the Eastern Front? Sorry for that term. From the international debates, meetings, and actions done by people or groups like U.S. and NATO and the EU it seems from our perspective like a lot's kind of coming around Ukraine, but what do they see?
I mean, I think civilians in eastern Ukraine are very far removed from the debate. The debate is also, from the international community's perspective, pretty minimal. There isn't much focus on Ukraine. I mean, at the end of the day, there is a war in Europe ongoing, and there is less focus on it than the conflict with the Islamic State in the Middle East. Next week, there are another round of talks to try and get both sides to start playing by the rules of the ceasefire. But since February, essentially none of the parts of the ceasefire are in place. Fighting has not stopped, so the word itself is irrelevant. Heavy artillery, a lot of it has been brought back from the front lines, but a lot of it is still in use. We saw grads being used. We saw evidence of 120mm mortars. So that hasn't happened. Obviously, Ukraine has not regained its border with Russia, so the rebel-held parts of its border with Russia. Elections haven't happened within DNR and LNR territory. And the banking system and the pension system that the Ukrainians halted in rebel territory has not been put back into place. So both sides aren't really bothering. And I think this further moves people away from the debate because they just don't have any trust in either side being serious about it. They might perhaps be if the fighting has stopped, but that, months on, that's still not the case. Fighting is calmer, certainly, and the sort of front lines are more static, like I mentioned before. But ultimately, civilian areas on both sides of the line are continuing to be shelled, and their lives continuing to be disrupted and ruined. And so, I think they're very far removed from the debate, and it's going to be very difficult to get them involved at any stage. Hopefully, the talks next week will get both sides sort of becoming a little bit more serious about it, but at the moment it doesn't look likely.
Right. So then with the lack of trust, because those are the facts that it is a war, it's not just a conflict as you were talking about. Do Ukrainians talk about who they perceive might be better to govern them between the different sides? Well,
the pro-Ukrainians obviously would prefer to keep their current government. I mean, there's still a lot of disillusionment with the government. There's been a lack of real positive moves in tackling corruption across the country, which is still a massive issue, and obviously one of the main reasons why there was a revolution last year in the first place. But when you're closer to the front lines, obviously a lot of people in the DNR are supportive of what the DNR are doing. Some people obviously are not. At the end of the day, the situation has become so dire for so many people there I think a lot of the time it's less about who's governing them, and they're more focused on just wanting an end to the fighting, wanting life to come back to normal. You know, a lot of people who would have traveled and worked between Donetsk and some of the other cities in the region, it's very, very difficult now because the Ukrainians have put in this essentially like a blockade in place. So if you want to travel between the two territories, you have to get a permit, and there are long queues between the two, and this has led to an issue of supplies within DNR territory. You know, supermarkets now are full of Russian produce rather than what you would normally find in Ukraine. You know, there's no cash. You can't get, it's very difficult to withdraw cash in the region, get your pensions. So people are having to travel across this border, this, you know, de facto border, and it's very, very difficult for them, and it takes hours, and it's, you know, people are fed up with that, and they would prefer just an end to the fighting and life to come back to normal.
And how far do those facts, I guess, kind of lead through the rest of Ukraine? Like if that's what you're seeing on a regular basis in eastern Ukraine, by the time you get to Kiev and maybe further west, do they I guess commiserate and empathize?
I'm sure to some extent. I mean, I haven't recently been to so many other parts of Ukraine. I tend to focus on the sort of regions surrounding the ATO zone, but so I can't say for sure. But I think, you know, there is obviously some people have family all over the place. So, you know, we met a lot of people crossing the border, going to visit family in other parts of the country. So of course there is understanding and commiseration, but I think a lot of people obviously in like very pro-Ukrainians are probably very much sort of saying, well, we told you so sort of vibe, you know, you're staying there, that's the situation you have to deal with. But, you know, a lot of people have left because of, you know, a lot of refugees have gone to Russia, a lot have come into the rest of Ukraine. It's a very difficult situation. And I'm sure there is a lot of empathy. There's a lot of, you know, people going backwards and forwards, delivering supplies, you know, humanitarian aid, that sort of thing. So it's very difficult, and it's definitely a situation that Ukrainians don't want to see increase or get worse or turn up in other parts of the country.
That's all I have for now. Thank you.
All right, okay, thank you very much, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks, Angie. Gosh, Ashley, I don't know where my brain is today. Well, Ashley, thank you. And Henry, you're doing a great job so far. So let's see if you can keep it up with these questions we got on
What
Twitter.
have we got next?
We got Wes. We got two tweets I want you to take a look at. Let's start with Wes's tweet. He just tweeted this to us. He wants to know if you think we're already in a Cold War. And I want you to pair that with this tweet we got from Edgar, who wants to know if you think a full-scale war or a Minsk 3.0 is more likely. What are your thoughts on those?
Okay, well, I don't want to be the guy to say that we are in the next, you know, Cold War 2.0, but I'd certainly say, you know, rhetoric is similar to that time. You know, Russians talking about nuclear weapons, you know, the United States and NATO moving forces towards the border, but obviously there's a lot of trade, a lot of movement between some of the countries in that area. You know, it's just I don't think it's Cold War at all. But what was the next tweet? Sorry, let me see that one.
Yeah, let me pull that back up for you.
Yeah.
This is Edgar, who wants to know full-scale war or Minsk 3.0.
There was a worry at the beginning of June that, you know, this possible summer offensive by the DNR was finally going to happen when we saw the DNR attack the town of Marinka. Though that attack failed, they lost quite a few troops, dozens more wounded. And from when we spoke to both Ukrainians and DNR soldiers around the town of Marinka, it seemed to be that it might have been, or at least both sides were also saying this, which is interesting, that this might have been a unit that operated not under the command of the DNR leadership, or it was some sort of probing attack to test the defences of Marinka. So there was a fear then that we were going to see this offensive, but it didn't seem to happen. And also this week we saw the DNR forces withdraw from the village of Shirokina, just to the east of Mariupol. There's been fighting in that village since the ceasefire. Both sides sort of at the time controlled sort of half and half of the village. But this week the DNR withdrew, claiming that they couldn't handle the artillery fire that was being shot against them, fired at them. So they withdrew, and the Ukrainians took control of the other half of the village. But there were rumours then that the Ukrainians were going to be ordered to withdraw, and some of the sort of soldiers on the Ukrainian side there weren't very happy at that possibility. But I mean, if it does collapse into a full-scale war again, you know, everyone would want there to be a Minsk III. But talking to some DNR soldiers near the Ukrainian-controlled village of Pisky last week, they were saying, look, if it's all-out war again, there's not going to be a Minsk III. They didn't want them to be one. Obviously, that doesn't mean that the DNR leadership believes that, but at least some of the soldiers there are basically tired of these ceasefires being put in place, tired of them collapsing, and yeah, they weren't very positive of a final ceasefire.
All right, man. Well, thank you for answering those. I hope the people at home got their questions answered. Let's talk to Andre. He's our last caller on Skype today.
Cool.
Hi there.
Hi, Andre. How are you?
Hi. Glad you're in the States.
Me too.
It's an interesting time because Ukraine is undergoing a lot of different changes right now, not only the war, but economically. And maybe important to some people is the fact that they passed a large decommunization law in May that gives them 9 months to rename over 1,000 place names, 2 provinces, take down a lot of statues. And at the same time, in the United States, there's a movement afoot to take down flags, rename highways, take down statues as well. You may have missed it on your way back from Europe that the Confederate flag and the symbols of the Confederacy are being taken down. I wonder if you could give us a couple of thoughts on the status of decommunization in Ukraine, vis-a-vis what's happening popularly outside Ukraine as well.
I mean, we've seen Lenin statues being pulled down across the country since the start of the revolution. There was in December 2013, they pulled down the Lenin statue just off the Maidan, not too far from the main square. So we've seen a lot of that repeat across the country, especially in areas close to the ATO zone. And yeah, I think this law is very, I mean, it's very interesting, but I think there are bigger fish to fry for the Ukrainian government. Yes, I can see where they're coming from. They want to kind of possibly erase some of that, but ultimately Ukraine has much bigger problems than a few statues and a few street names. This is just my opinion, but you have massive corruption to handle, an economy that's nosediving, and obviously the war in the east. And I think there's always a risk that it could push people within the DNR territories or nearby who might be sympathetic to the DNR further away from the Ukrainian government. You know, we've been told by Russian propaganda and Russian government that the Ukrainian government is a fascist junta and all this sort of thing, and that they're going to sort of attack the Russian language or infringe upon Russian speakers' rights. And a law like this, there's always a chance that it could give them extra ammunition. So I think it's obviously controversial, but I think they should probably be focusing on much more pressing issues.
Well, there's a lot of things going on in Ukraine, and in fact, just last week we opened 5 Holocaust memorials in Western Ukraine. So all these things happen in any country. Another issue, though, is American politics. For some reason, even though President Obama has been to Europe several times, he has refused to stop by Ukraine. And every single American politician who's gone over, whether it's a congressional delegation, whether it's Vice President Biden visiting, has been overwhelmed with the need to support Ukraine once he visits there and understands the situation over there. So do you think that we'll be seeing any of the presidential candidates maybe visit Ukraine before the primaries start here in the United States to give them a sense of what's going on over there?
I think it'd probably be a very good idea if they did do that. Obviously, we've seen people like John McCain, a very Republican, very hawkish on the whole subject, and been very supportive of Ukraine, and obviously Biden's visits as well. But I think it's going to be a problem that will continue for obviously years to come. And so any presidential candidate needs to get a handle on this situation, and there needs to be more debate on the Ukraine crisis. There is very little really talk about it. Like I've mentioned before, this is a war in Europe, and it's not being ignored, but I don't think it's getting the attention that it deserves and it needs. This is a war that's killed over 6,400 people. And after the Balkan Wars, we said that this would never happen again. in Europe, and here we are. And there's not enough action on this conflict, and I think it would be a very good idea if any candidate would come here to try and at least get a handle on the situation and try and form some real lasting policies that can bring peace to eastern Ukraine.
Thanks.
All right, no worries, Andre. Thank you very much.
All right, Henry, we're right near the end of the show. I just want to address a couple more tweets.
Okay, sure.
And then I'll let you go back to whatever you were doing before this. So we've got a couple of tweets in the same vein of thought.
Sure.
Ross wants to know what opinions you heard about Crimea. Do people on the ground think that Crimea might ever be part of Ukraine again? And also, our friend Stoner Smurf, 18, wants to know if average Ukrainians think that some of the territory they've lost could possibly be separate entities in the future. So thank you, Stoner Smurf, for that.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously most Ukrainians would want both both Crimea and the rebel-held territories of Donetsk and Luhansk to be once again part of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have said that that is something that they would want to do. They're never going to say that they won't, obviously, but doing that is a whole nother ballgame for them. I don't think most pro-Ukrainians at all would be willing to accept those regions to be separate countries, and the same with Crimea. There's obviously, I think the Ukrainians see themselves as having been let down by the international community in terms of this whole crisis. There was a lot of support from Western nations, EU, the United States, for the revolution in the first place, to get rid of Yanukovych, to move closer to the international community. And then Russia annexed Crimea, and all that they've had is sort of talk from the international community about Russia giving Crimea back to Ukraine. We know that's not likely to happen. Also, in terms of Crimea, back in 1994, the United States and some European nations signed a treaty with Ukraine, saying if you give over your nuclear weapons, we will protect your sovereignty in case it's ever breached. And obviously, with Crimea, that didn't happen. So again, it's another pointer to them being let down. But I think the average Ukrainian would very much like both regions to be back within Ukrainian control.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for answering those. Again, I hope the people who tweeted them got to see those answers. Henry, this is the end of the show, so why don't you tell everybody what's coming next from you and say goodbye? Well,
so I've only just returned from Ukraine, so in the next couple of weeks there should be some footage showing the situation of the ceasefire, or the lack of, coming from Ukraine. So that's what I'll be focusing on in the next couple of weeks. It's really great to be back on the show, and I was really thankful for guys Skyping in and people sending the tweets all week as well. So thanks very much. The shelling is so close and constant here in Pisky. You can hear the shell or the missile flying through the air. But that doesn't seem to bother the soldiers here. They're so used to the shelling, and they've been here so long that they don't even flinch when it comes near. They only seem to move when they can tell it's actually going to drop real close.
Это уже к нам. Бегом туда, бегом, бегом.